Yeah. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
And welcome. I trust everybody has gotten their breakfast, or if you haven't, please feel free to get up during the program and help yourself. Thank you so much for being here. I know it's not an easy day to get here for those of you that have to commute, or if you're like me, spending 20 minutes trying to scrape your windshield in cursing Chicago winter. So I appreciate you coming out, especially in the middle of the day for our charter school folks. I know that's not an easy thing to do, and spending your time with us. This is going to be a really, I hope, interesting and exciting program for you. Most of this is going to be spent with you listening to the people you should be listening to, which is your colleagues, talking about our work. But Dana and I are going to do some framework on the front end to just situate why we're doing what we're doing, kind of giving you the reason for the work that's been going on. And then we'll have a panel of your colleagues who will come up and talk after that. So where I thought I would begin, it's always important to begin with what we do and to remind you what UEI is and does. And obviously this is the center of our work. And I should say that as we think about this branding and positioning and putting UEI forth to the world, one of the things I don't want to be misconstrued about what we're doing is that it somehow is changing what we're doing, because it isn't. It's more trying to think about the ways to communicate and share with the world what you already know about what UEI is and does. And so this is in no way meant to change course. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. It's about taking the work that we do and communicating about it in a shared way to celebrate the accomplishments that we've had and the great work that all of you do every day. So by now, I hope we all know the 4 units of UEI. This is something that we've driven home. As you know, we have now a long history together as a joint organization. But we have these 4 amazing units that do the work that we do, starting with the consortium. Our oldest, the kind of grandmother of the organization, entering its 27th year, and really doing applied, rigorous research that aims not just to study Chicago public schools, but to enter into a dialogue with the school district about what's working and what isn't as partners, and to help to move the field. And one of the things I think we're proudest of is the influence the consortium has had nationally, and in this kind of place-based, rigorous approach to really help in holding up the mirror and helping school districts to look at their practice and to get better. And also important indicators, as we know, have come out of the consortium's research that are now being used at UChicago Impact and nationally to move the field. We have UChicago UTEP, our Urban Teacher Education Program, residency-based approach to training teachers. Was one of the first residency programs in the country. What residency means is this idea of clinical training of teachers, almost like the way you would train a doctor, where we think about embedding teachers, aspiring teachers in schools, and for them to have a full year opportunity to student teach. Contrasting that with what you see in the rest of the field, where student teachers, and many of you who did student teaching, might have only had a semester, you might have only had a couple of months. What we're trying to do is give teachers really deep experiences on the ground, and in urban education particularly, and understanding the urban context and specifically Chicago. We also, in case you don't know, offer our graduates 3 years of coaching support wherever they land in Chicago. This is an incredible commitment. And we think it's one of the reasons for our 90% retention rate, 5-year retention rate of our teachers in the field. We're very proud of that. UChicago Charter, our school, this is the heart of our organization in the sense that we're all here to serve students, and this is the closest touch that we have to students. We serve about 1,900 kids here on the south side of Chicago, 2 elementary campuses, a middle school campus, and a combined secondary campus, 6th through 12th grade. You haven't seen the new high school facility that we're building. It's gorgeous. It has bricks on it now. I was just over there yesterday, so please go take a look. And really building critical thinkers and leaders is the goal. 100% college graduation, but mostly building critical thinkers and leaders for the future is the Chicago Charter's work. And then finally, if the consortium is our grandmother, then UChicago Impact is I would say, a toddler now, not a baby. Focus on taking our research-based practice proving tools national, and I believe our new count is 33 states where our work is present, literally touching the lives of millions of students across the country, and disseminating, importantly, work that was born here, like the 5 Essentials, which came out of the consortium, STEP, which came out of a combined research and practice partnership between the consortium and the charter school. So this is what we do. All of you are connected to one of these pieces of work, and it's always important to ground ourselves in what UEI is and does. So here's the interesting piece of our history, and many of you, I look around the room, have been in the room as long as I have, and some of you longer, and so you know that we have a really long history, but it's also a short history in some respects. So we have to remember that our history predates the Urban Education Institute. It actually goes back to the founding of the Center for School Improvement in 1988. And over the time period between when the Center for School Improvement started and when the Urban Education Institute was formally started, 3 of our 4 units were already up and running. So your history and your units predates the founding of UEI formally, which as many of you know happened in 2008. But we've accomplished a lot since 2008, and I think one of the things that we don't always do is slow down and take time to recognize the way that our work is moving the field, because we're all busy and we want to contribute and we want to keep moving and we're never satisfied. But this is just a list of some of our accomplishments, which I think it's very important for us to celebrate across our units. So for instance, over the past 10 years, 13 cities, and it may even be more, consortium folks, you can correct me if I'm wrong, have replicated the consortium's model. They're literally trying to emulate exactly what the consortium is doing because this place-based research model to move practice in school districts is so powerful. We know that 100% of our seniors have been accepted to college 5 years in a row. Here's the number, more than 2.8 million students nationwide are touched by impacts tools. And I mentioned the 90% retention rate of our teachers in the field. These are numbers, each one of our individual units is seen as a model or a leader in the field. It doesn't mean that everything we're doing is perfect, but if you lifted out those individual units and put them out into the landscape, they would be considered to be among the best in the field, which is pretty amazing. We're contributing new knowledge to the field. I don't know how many of you saw the New Knowledge campaign that came out, and we should recognize Sung and Lucinda, Ashley, and Dana for this incredible work. Sung, your design work on this is absolutely gorgeous. If you haven't had a chance to see this, please do go in there. But this idea that what UEI does across all of our bodies of work is this evidence-based approach and disseminating knowledge throughout the field in a way that doesn't include advocacy, it doesn't include an agenda, it's just where the evidence takes us. And I can't tell you how many people contacted me and said, this is incredible. You are moving the field on so many dimensions, practice, research, policy, and doing that collectively across a number of bodies of work that don't usually exist under the same roof, which is what UEI represents. So, but here's where the story turns. What is UEI? Who are we? What is our identity as a whole? Up to this date, we are primarily known for our individual accomplishments, for what our individual units do. So you notice that those accomplishments that I listed out for you are connected to individual units. And there's nothing bad about that. This is how we've built the legacy that we've built to date, is by making contributions from the individual units. And you can see the recognition and the kind of accomplishments that are represented here. But the question now is, what is UEI's story? How do we encapsulate what UEI as a whole is doing? And I would argue that there's 2 dimensions of why this is important. It's important internally, so that when we think collectively about what we're doing together, that our identity is both our unit identity as a member of the consortium or as a member of UTEP or the charter school or Impact, but it also is connected to our identity as UEI, as the Urban Education Institute. And so that's what this work that Dana and her team have been leading, and many of you have engaged in, is focused on, is thinking about that collective accomplishment, that collective identity that we have as the Urban Education Institute. So this is a moment where I just want to recognize the work that Dana and Lucinda and Ashley and Son have done. This has been an incredible amount of work that has gone into this, and so thoughtful in the way that they didn't just plunge forward and say, this is our branding identity, this is our positioning platform, this is who we are. Instead, they backed up and they collected a lot of evidence and data to understand exactly what you as staff members think UEI is and what our identity is, but also going to external stakeholders and asking them, what do they think UEI is? What do they think are the unique contributions of this collective entity? And so you can see the kind of data that they've been collecting over the last 18 months in terms of both looking at what we've done with communications internally historically, in terms of sending out a survey to all of you and saying, what do you think? And a lot of external interviews on the phone with stakeholders identified by the heads of each of our units to say, what is UEI's identity and what should it be? So I'm going to focus in on one piece of this, which came from the UEI staff survey. And some of you probably will remember this question if you responded to the survey. And this is a fun activity. I enjoyed doing this when the survey came out. Imagine Time Magazine wants to feature UEI on its cover 5 years from now. What do you hope the headline would say? What I'm going to show you is some of the headlines that you, those of you who filled out the survey, what you said would be on the cover of Time Magazine. So here are a few of them. School improvement done right. Education, research, and practice powerhouse UEI helps cities across America emulate Chicago's extraordinary progress. And by the way, if this was you, your title, you can feel free to raise your hand and take that. UEI, transforming the way we approach school. Research, best practices, teacher training, impactful tools. The achievement gap, how UEI helped close it in urban schools nationwide through holistic approaches to learning. UEI initiatives spur massive shift in public education. How Chicago led the nation so that all students achieve scholastic success. So the common theme in all of this, and this is a theme that runs across the data that Dana and her team collected, is about disrupting the status quo. So what exactly is the status quo? Here are quotes from the interviews and surveys that Dana and her team did. And you can see there's direct quotes in here: fragmentation, internal conflicts of interest, low expectations, lack of knowledge, the fact that the education field is siloed, a lack of political will. But really at the top of all that are issues of inequity and inequality. And so this is a way of trying to hone in on exactly what it is we're trying to do as an organization that spans across all of the work we do, beyond just our individual contributions, both our individual projects and our units, to thinking broadly about what UEI as a whole does. So here are some quotes on inequity in education as we focus in on that particular lever, that particular focal point that we think UEI is focused on. There's an external stakeholder here. We have not yet figured out how to educate all kids well, particularly kids living in poverty. UEI is dedicated to figuring out what it takes to make that happen and how to inform people of how to make that happen. Our own Elaine Allensworth, while we have equal access to education, the quality and resources available are not equal. And then finally, Arnie Duncan, this is from the To and Through Kickoff. Change is hard, I recognize that. But when you have a system that actually perpetuates inequity and inequality, we have to challenge that. So underneath all of this, we believe, and the senior management team of UEI has spent a lot of time talking about this and discussing this, and I know that Dana and her team have come to the leadership teams of the individual units as well, about this, focusing in on this idea of UEI existing to challenge educational inequities. Here is our mission statement. The mission of the University of Chicago Urban Education Institute is to create knowledge and produce reliably excellent schooling. So urban, the challenge of against inequities and inequalities. So I'm going to pause and let Dana take over here, and Dana's going to walk you through sort of the reasoning behind this work, the rationale for it, but also the process that she and her team have engaged in to situate UEI within the larger landscape to understand our identity and branding. And that's going to lead to a conversation about the proposed branding that we have now put together for your consideration, which is kind of going to be the culmination of the work that's happened. So I'm going to turn it over to Dana to take over. And before Dana comes up, may I just say, can we please recognize Dana and her team for the incredible work that they've done? I think they really, the communications team has really pushed our thinking about both this work, but they also support so many of the things that you do day to day, and sometimes go unrecognized. So I just want to make sure that we recognize them. So Dana, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, So I've met most of you guys, but I'm actually a newcomer. I'm compared to a lot of you veterans. I've only been here for about a year and 3 months. So I lead our communications and engagement team, and I'm up here representing Sung Cho and Lucinda Fickle and Ashley Zofer and our newest addition, Hannah Frank. And all of them have put so much effort and work into this. So I want to pick up where Sarah left off in talking about another question that we asked both internal and external stakeholders. So this is one of the other questions in the survey that went out around this time last year, which is, okay, great, we're focused on tackling educational inequities, but are there other organizations doing the same thing? Who do you perceive, or what organizations do you perceive as being similar to UEI in some way, shape, or form? And the most commonly cited responses were other education-focused organizations sitting within academic institutions, sort of operating at the nexus of research and practice. So Stanford's Graduate School of Education, Johns Hopkins, Fordham, Harvard. But what was interesting is when we dug in and when we looked at the way that they articulate their mission statements, we noticed that none of them focused explicitly on urban schooling, improving urban education. So we see a lot of language like shaping educational practices, preparing leaders in education, advancing educational excellence, advancing the quality of education. But none of these other organizations have made it their mission explicitly to improve urban education. And we have a long history. This is actually very interesting as we went back and did the sort of historic tracing and looked at our DNA and each of the individual units and the language that the individual units use to describe their missions and their purposes. It became very clear that we have a history of confronting issues of inequity, issues of race and class and culture head-on in the work that we do. And I've just pulled some examples of the many that we charted over the course of UEI's history to bring that to life. So on the charter school's website, front and center, it says each campus envelops students in a culture of high academic achievement with explicit attention to issues of race, class, and culture that affect urban schooling. UTEP, as some of you may know, has a soul strand curriculum that encourages candidates to really explore issues of their own identity and educational equity and the ways that race and class and gender and sexual orientation and culture sort of enter into the classroom and affect both teachers and students. And in fact, UTEP was featured, as many of you know, in this book, Inspiring Teaching, and it was founded, quote, on the assumption that a high-quality education is a critical lever for achieving social justice, for leveling the playing field. And they describe their graduates as instructional leaders and agents for educational equity in their schools and communities. The consortium. So years and years ago, way back in 2004, Charles Payne was actually here and gave a speech on race in the Chicago school system at the consortium symposium on race, Chicago school reform, and school politics. And the consortium has not shied away through the course of its history from pointing out racial disparities and other inequities in our schools, and neither has UChicago Impact. So this is actually one example. It's an excerpt from a job description that UChicago Impact recently posted on LinkedIn. And it acknowledges that only 3% of the 14% of CPS students, and by the way, these numbers have improved since this was posted, who complete a bachelor's degree by the time that they're 25, so within about 10 years of completing high school, are African American or Latino males. And UChicago Impact said in its job description very explicitly, many view these problems as intractable. We do not. We confront them head on. And that's not to say that other institutions don't touch these issues of race and class and culture and inequity in education. But what was interesting is when we sort of delved into their messaging and their communication, it became clear that they do that from more of a distance. So when you look at the home pages of Stanford and Harvard and Fordham and Johns Hopkins and some of those other organizations that people perceive as similar to the Urban Education Institute, you see images of the Ivory Tower, you see images of the wrought iron gates, you see stacks of research papers, you see awards that the university has won. When you go to our website, you see the work that we're doing in the field, in the trenches, on the front lines, the work that we're doing with students every day. And in fact, that's actually one of our critical points of difference as an organization. So one of our big supporters, external stakeholders, actually called me one day and said, you know what, I have a challenge for you. I want you to look at Forbes' list of top 100 colleges and find out, do some reconnaissance and find out if any one of them own and operate a public charter school. And we found that we are the only education organization nestled within an academic institution in the country that owns and operates a public charter school. Stanford actually used to. 5 years ago, they had to shut it down due to poor performance. So now we are the only ones in the country that actually not just support practice, but we're practicing. And so these are just a couple of quotes that are illustrative of the themes that we heard from internal stakeholders and external stakeholders alike. And when I talk about external stakeholders, I'm talking about the full range of folks that we work with. So I'm talking about, our funders. I'm talking about advocacy group leaders. I'm talking about nonprofit organizations, other research organizations, the baby consortia, which are not babies anymore necessarily, that have said there is absolutely nothing like the Urban Education Institute. They offer applied knowledge to improve all facets of urban education. They've changed the conversation about what it takes to improve at the school level. They're at the front line, and we are very much at the front line. We are researching and practicing in the middle of one of the most diverse, but unfortunately also one of the most racially and economically segregated cities in America. And we are practicing and researching within an institution that actually has a long yet complex history of launching research and interdisciplinary research and practice into race and politics and culture. So what does this all mean in terms of how does it all come together, and what is our collective challenge and our collective opportunity when we think of the work that we're doing across units? So our challenge is, as Sarah said, and based on all of the work that we've done, is really at its core tackling educational inequity. So leveling the playing field for our youth with knowledge from both our research and our practice on what works to set students of all races and genders and socioeconomic backgrounds up for success in both school and in life. And our point of difference is the fact that we do this together, not just with research, but through practice, under the same roof, within the same four walls, and whether we realize it or not, we're working every day together toward a common purpose. All of us in some capacity is working to change the odds and break down these traditional silos that exist within the education field, whether it's through rigorous applied research, whether it's through teacher training, tool development, and dissemination, the work we're doing on the ground in our award-winning charter school. We are collectively working to change the odds and improve the chances for thousands of children in urban America, in Chicago, but across urban America. And so our North Star, in sum, is closing the gaps. We are collectively working to do that every day, whether we realize it or not, in so many different ways. And I use gaps, plural, because we're not just talking about closing the achievement gap, which I think many people think of when they hear closing the gap. We're talking about closing the knowledge gap, so the gap between common beliefs about what works to improve education outcomes and really deep insight that sheds light on what matters most for improving schools and for improving student outcomes. And we're doing this in so many different ways. This is just illustrative of the dozens of ways we're doing it across units. through the student agency score that the charter school is working to develop. And I'm not going to go into depth on all of these things because that's what our panelists are for, and who better to speak to the work of UEI than the people who are actually doing it. But these are just some examples up here. We're also working to close the preparation gap. So the gap between practitioners' passion for education and then the preparation and ongoing support that they receive to succeed in urban schools in the field. We're doing it through the 5-year preparation model, UTEP's 5-year preparation model that Sarah mentioned, the warm demanders framework that you hear Shane Evans always talking about, the STEP learning system, which we'll hear more about on our panel later, and of course the consortium's capacity building research. We're working on closing the belief gap, so the gap between pervasive stereotypes about what urban youth are capable of achieving and what we know they actually can achieve. And we're doing that through fostering growth mindsets, our 6 to 16 curriculum, which enables kids to sort of envision their future and is very deliberate in doing so. And we'll hear more about that later. And the attainment gap, we talked a lot about this in the context of the 2 and Through project, this huge gap between students' aspirations and attainment with respect to college. And so I think in Chicago right now, 76% of CPS freshmen aspire to earn a bachelor's degree, yet only 18% will by the time they're 25 or within 10 years of starting high school. So we're working to close that gap in a myriad of ways. And again, this is not, I wasn't supposed to flash up the appendix. This is my cue to be quiet now and to let the people who are at the helm of these projects and working to close these various gaps talk about that work. A lot of it is new and emerging. Some of it is work that is ongoing, but developing in really exciting ways. And so now I'm going to call up our panelists, and Mr. Alex Seeskin, UEI's Chief Strategy Officer, who will facilitate our panel. So thank you very much.
Panelists want to come up and take a seat at the table. All right, so as Dave said, I'm Alex Seeskin, I'm the Chief Strategy Officer here, and I've had the privilege and pleasure over the last 3 years that I've been at UEI at leading work across many of the different units. And so today is so exciting for me to see a table full of people that I've worked with and collaborated with over the past 3 years. All together at one table to talk about this work, which is just super, super exciting. So we'll start with the knowledge gap, which, as Dana mentioned, is the gap between the common beliefs about what works in education and what our insight into what matters most for school improvement. And Marisa De La Torre, we'll start with you from the consortium. You and your team have looked at many different aspects of the high school experience over the past few years. If you could convey 1 or 2 takeaways for schools or for families, what would you most want them to know about high school and the high school landscape in Chicago?
So we recently have published a couple of studies about the high school choice system in Chicago and the benefits of attending different types of high schools in Chicago. And as probably most of you know, Chicago is an open enrollment system, so families when the kids are going to attend ninth grade, they can apply to many different high schools. and there is a wide range. There are more than 120 high schools. We have selective enrollment high schools, charter schools, neighborhood schools, military academies, and so on, right? Lots of choice, and the process is very stressful for families and for kids that want to do that, right? Many different requirements and different choices. And for different reasons, families are pretty aware of selective enrollment high schools, right? And I think some of the numbers are that more than half of the 8th grade cohort actually apply for selective enrollment high schools, and they only have 10% of the seats of the whole 9th grade cohort, right? So there's a lot of competition for these seats. And no wonder why families really think about this choice, right? I mean, they're on the press all the time. They have so many. They are often ranked as the top high schools in the state. 4 of the selective enrollment high schools are in the top 5 in the state. 2 are ranked as the top 50 in the U.S. So people really hear about this, and they really want their students to go to these places. So one of the studies really dig into what are the benefits of attending these selective enrollment high schools. And what we find is that in terms of academic outcomes, not many differences between kids that just get above the cutoff point, right, in the application process versus the ones that are just below. So the outcomes in terms of test scores, graduation, college enrollment, very similar for those two. There are some costs, however, associated with attending selective enrollment high schools, and that's especially true if kids come from low-income neighborhoods. We see lower GPAs and lower likelihood of attending selective colleges, right? So in some sense, I guess one of the messages is that it's not the end of the world if you're a student that's getting into a selective enrollment high school, because there are other options there that provide very similar outcomes to them, right? But that's not to say that there are no benefits to attending them. What we see also is that students report better environments in the selective enrollment high school, so that might be one of the reasons why families look for this place.
What would you say, and we should just make sure that we speak up because we don't have microphones here, and we've got people way in the back. So, Marisa, what would you say, so much of the attention on your work focused on selective high schools. What would you say some of the takeaways were or are around mid-tier or high-tier neighborhood high schools around the city?
Yeah, so it's true, a lot of attention gets dedicated to selective enrollment high schools, but we did this study looking at all the high schools in the system. And, many different school reform efforts have the central assumption that if you send kids to better performing high schools, they will do better. So we wanted to look at a whole range of different options. And what we find is that students, similar to the selective enrollment high schools, students that attend higher performing high schools, and we measure that by ACT scores and graduation rates, really report better environments. So they really experience better relationships with the peers, with the teachers, safety levels are much higher. So we see that the environment really gets, the student reports much better environment the higher the performance. And even though we didn't find academic benefits for students that are attending selective enrollment high schools, we do find academic benefits when they go to higher performing neighborhood schools and charter schools in Chicago. We see that there is a boost in test score, graduation, and college enrollment, and persistence. So some benefits there. Again, we see a little bit of the cost in terms of GPA. Lower GPAs, the higher the performing the school is. So I think in essence, 2 messages come from these 2 different papers. One is if a student qualifies for selective enrollment high school, but they can attend, and if they don't get to attend one of those, attending a high-performing non-selective option in Chicago might provide similar outcomes to them, and in some cases even better if you think about GPA. And for students who might not have access to these places, attending a high-performing high school, compared to a low-performing high school, do provide actually benefits in terms of academics.
Thank you. Dave Johnson, senior researcher at the Consortium, and we asked you to talk a little bit about the IB study from a few years ago. International Baccalaureate being a program, a high school program that some high schools were implementing. And the consortium came out with a report about those. Before the report came out, what were some of the common assumptions that people made about which students could benefit from rigorous, challenging instructional climate? And how do you think the report changed the thinking about which students were ready for that type of rigor?
So I think, for one thing, the IB program, I think at this point has a much higher profile in Chicago than it did, 10 years ago. I don't think that's a credit necessarily to our work per se. The mayor's expansion really put it on the map in a lot of ways, both locally and nationally. But before that expansion, when we were studying the IB program, I think there was an assumption related to some of what Marisa was just describing around who benefits from selective enrollment or from enrolling in a higher performing high school. There was an assumption that it was the kids who were the highest achieving from the outset, right? So those kids who had the highest test scores in elementary school were the ones who were going to be able to do it, right? The ones who could hack it in those high performing, rigorous environments. So the selective enrollment schools that Marisa was referencing a minute ago were taking kids typically around the 8th or 9th stay-9 in terms of those 8th grade test scores. Right? Those are the highest achieving kids in the district. When we looked at the neighborhood IB programs, these were small programs, most of them founded in the late 1990s under Paul Vallis. They were really serving about 300 to 400 graduates a year, and most of those kids were coming from significantly lower achieving bands than those 8th or 9th stay-9 kids. The IB programs in neighborhood high schools were taking kids as low as the 5th or 6th stay-9, and they were producing GPAs among their graduates that were as good or better than the selective enrollment high schools, and similar rates of college enrollment. And ultimately, that was really what I think we took from that study in terms of lessons about who might benefit by these programs, was this idea that we become kind of blinkered as a city, as a school system perhaps, but maybe also as researchers in thinking about what it would actually take in order to expose kids to that rigorous kind of instruction, what it would take on the kids' part. They were actually capable of a great deal more than I think people gave them credit for. And the proof was in the pudding then when we looked at those post-secondary outcomes for those kids.
Can you talk a little bit about, and this is the knowledge section, can you talk a little bit about the way you mentioned the mayor sort of grabbing onto that report? Can you talk a little bit about how the knowledge from that report was used both in the city of Chicago, whether rightly or wrongly, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, going a little off script here, and how knowledge about that report was applied to thinking about high school just outside of IB, for example. What is the broader takeaways, even outside of a very sort of narrow, approach like IB?
Sure. So we could flatter ourselves and imagine that the mayor expanded IB because we said it was working really well. And maybe there's a grain of truth in there somewhere. There are perhaps people who know more than I do about how the mayor thinks, what he thinks, and why. But I won't touch that particular lightning rod. I think though the thing that I would say about what we hoped for out of that study was that it would help people to understand something more about what was possible, not only for those lower achieving kids who typically were not getting access to those selective enrollment schools, but that it would also help people understand something more about what that kind of experience could mean for those kids. Right? So the outcomes we were looking at were the likelihood of enrolling in a selective college, the likelihood of persisting in a selective college, and we really saw strong effects of being in those IB programs on those two outcomes. In particular, that persistence effect was one that we'd never seen anywhere else before. So we had looked at things like whether or not taking AP courses mattered for kids' likelihood of persisting in college. We'd looked at other aspects of high school coursework, trying to understand what was it that was going to make kids more likely to stick once they got into college. And the IB program was one of the first places we really saw traction there. We really saw an effect of that program. Now, we weren't able to take apart why, but a lot of the work that Camille Farrington and other folks at the consortium have been engaged in since around building out the understanding of non-cognitive factors and how they come into play as students make that transition from high school to college, a lot of that was driven by the findings from that IB report, by the sense that we had from the qualitative component in that report in particular, that something was happening with those kids that was changing how they saw themselves as students, how they understood themselves as learners, and how they then behaved once they were on college campuses, particularly in terms of the demands they put on college campuses. I think we often think about, let's figure out how to give kids an inoculation that will prepare them for the next bad environment they get into. And IB was in a lot of ways something that we came into thinking maybe there's a way to prepare kids for the crappy colleges they'll be going to, where they'll be able to figure out how to do this. I think we're still struggling with what the message is that the higher education community takes from reports like this, but one of the things we found is that you really can alter kids' capacity for not only how they understand themselves, but how they understand what other people owe them. And when they were on those college campuses, they had strategies and ideas about what it was that they were entitled to from the adults whose responsibility it was to serve them in those institutions that looked different to us, that really suggested to us that that program was teaching them something special about what it was that it meant to be a member of an academic community. And that trickled up then into those college environments where those kids were able to advocate for themselves in a different way.
Thank you. Bill Kennedy, the Assistant Director of UTEP's Elementary Pathway. I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the gap, the difference between the traditional persistence, 5-year persistence rate for teachers and UTEP's 90% persistence rate. And how UTEP has been able to close the aspiring teacher's knowledge gap from when they come into the program through when UTEP sort of says, go forth after the 3 years of coaching. What is it about closing that knowledge gap for teachers in the UTEP program that keeps them in classrooms so much longer than graduates from other programs?
So, I think there are a number of things. I think when we think about UTEP, we try to, the statistics that you're talking about, Alex, people aren't familiar. 30% of teachers in 3 years, 50% of teachers in 5 years leave the profession. Sometimes that means leaving to go into other educational occupations, but in general it often means sort of leaving the occupation entirely. Urban systems, that statistic is even higher, especially when we think about 20 to 25% of urban teachers leaving in their first year. Sometimes those teachers are leaving for suburban systems or for systems that are serving student populations that are less marginalized in society, but in general, what that it's bleeding a system in terms of keeping teachers and institutional knowledge within schools and building traditions that we know urban schools need. So part of what we do, there are a number of things that we try to take the models that exist, and I think UTEP is a hybrid of many of the sort of two approaches, traditional approaches to teacher education. So sort of historical teacher education approaches are very sort of theoretical based, they're taught at universities, maybe perhaps some of you went to some of those who've been teachers. Distant from the context where people actually end up teaching, and often taught by people who have not actually done the work necessary that they're preparing people to do. The new reform approach is a much more of a practice-based approach, sort of situated within the context of schools that they're preparing them specifically for. The critique of that is that there's an automaticity that is sort of encouraged, a sort of lack of critical thinking around the actual approach to teaching, but just a sort of implementation of systems and approaches and practices that are necessary and effective and research-based, and if you just do them, it'll work. We try to take the best parts of both of those pieces. We still very much have an approach that roots teaching in theoretical knowledge and historical understanding of the profession. There are many great ideas over the last century that have been developed around teaching, some of which began right on this campus. But we also are very much encouraging teachers to begin to understand the idea of practice-based approaches and trying to use those research-based practices to get teachers to do the small pieces of work that are repetitive and sort of rehearsed and give people the opportunity to develop some automaticity so that there's not all the thinking that is necessary for a teacher to do in a day solely on the backs of young, often inexperienced individuals. But there's more to that. I think the context-based approach that we try to do is also a hybrid. I think that we try to situate our candidates in the first 2 years of the program in contexts within the communities that they're going to be working in, but a broad diversity of those, not just one context, not just one classroom or one school, but a variety of schools within the system. CPS is an incredibly diverse system, and so to call it all one urban system is actually sort of, as we were hearing from the consortium, right, there's a real range of types of schools where teachers have to be able to work, and so we try to prepare and situate people in those contexts. And then within the 3 years that come after that, there's a support level that, and just to kind of go into the model a little bit, I think there's a way to think about teacher preparation as preparation for the very first day, right? And there's sort of this dichotomy between teacher preparation and then when you become a teacher, there's sort of professional development or in-service, and those two things often don't talk to one another. And so we really have this idea that it's a 5-year approach, that we take a much longer time on the front end, give people 2 full years of developed and gradual experience where they have the opportunity to really reflect on their practice, but then we don't say that first when you get your first classroom. I think that's the mistake that many urban preparation programs or preparation programs in general think, is that first day is good enough, and once you're there, good luck, right? But this idea of I forget how you just said it, but like go off and be with, that we sort of hold the hand of the teacher for the first 3 years in a gradual way as well. So our model provides teacher induction coaching on a weekly basis in classroom coach. So we think about this as education, right? It's preparation and ongoing education. So our program provides induction support that we think of as ongoing teacher education. It's not support only. It's not coaching only, right? It's taking the context and the situations that teachers are grappling with on a daily basis as their first-year teachers and helping them root it in the work that we did in the 2 years prior, right? And developing that line of thinking, those theoretical understandings, those practices, and developing those on a weekly basis in their first year of teaching, and a bi-weekly basis in their second year of teaching, and then a once a month basis in their third year of teaching. That sort of gradual release, thinking that by the end of their third year, and what we consider to be their 5th year in the program, is an opportunity for them to begin to be teacher leaders in their schools. And we think that has a major contribution, absolutely, to the much higher retention rate that we show than your typical programs, and even some of the residency-based programs that are our sort of colleagues, and I hesitate to call them competitors, but certainly our colleagues in the residency world. So.
Thank you. I think that's a nice transition to the preparation gap. Nicole Temple is the STEP Coach and Literacy Coordinator Associate for U Chicago Impact. STEP, a lot of us who aren't familiar with STEP, I was talking about this with Maggie and Elliot yesterday, think about STEP as just an assessment. So there may be people who aren't familiar with STEP and say, well, it's a reading assessment that gets pushed out to the to any school who wants to buy it, but that's not right. That doesn't hit, I would say, actually, even maybe a small part, but not nearly the whole. Can you talk a little bit about how STEP's model helps teachers grow and improve their literacy instruction, and by doing so begins to close the preparation gap?
Sure. So STEP is, a heart of our work is the professional development, and we go into schools and look at leadership capacity, teacher capacity, coaching capacity, where they are, assess their needs, and then provide them with professional development based on those needs, so that they're able then to lead data-driven instruction. We see throughout the nation how unprepared teachers are to teach reading. Yet we know it continues to be one of our biggest struggles in education. And so our goal is to provide them with the training content that they need, and expose them to rigorous applied research. We were just in working in Camden now for a couple of years, and this is our second year. And when we arrived, lots of hesitation in terms of teachers, leaders, closed doors. Gosh, this is another implementation that's coming and going, and we very much understood because we're all teachers and former teachers and educators, and so it took a while. But we were last week leading. I was with Julie, and we were leading a leadership cohort where we bring all the leaders throughout the district and work together with their lead educators and with their teachers, or with their leaders and principals. And when we began last year, no one would talk, no one would, it was just so closed door. It was hard to get conversation. And this one of our last weeks, somebody mentioned how they're now running this mini boot camp where teachers and leaders are leading and putting themselves out there to share what they've learned throughout this training. So it's not just the literacy, but it's the mindset, it's the culture, and it's empowering the entire staff to again then narrow and close that literacy gap.
And can you talk a little bit about the changes more recently to STEP, the innovations that we should be looking for in the future from STEP? I know there's a ton of different things in the pipeline.
Sure. So I think our most exciting, I'd say, piece of work right now currently is we've expanded our product line. We're now, it was pre-K to third if on grade levels. We've extended that to third through sixth. So now working and really targeting that middle elementary adolescence age where working on that, piloting that right now in schools. Schools have been asking for this for years, and so we're just excited to actually finally be there. I think what's most exciting too with this piece of work is we're going to be able to generate these theories and see what is not out there with research, and what do these students need? What are their reading needs? What do we need to create? And there's not a lot of professional development, valid assessments out there. So we're really, I think, most excited about this product line right now. We also we've moved, now we're online, so the assessment is online. Teachers still input the data, and it's still a one-on-one assessment. But this has also been something really exciting for us, and I know really exciting, compared to what's out there currently, what's available to teachers, competitors. So we're really excited about that. It's also cut down on teacher time, which we know is obviously so valuable. Purple, yellow. So our current series, we're constantly meeting the differentiating needs of what we see out there, keeping up with current research. I think that's it's there's never enough. We just keep going, which is exciting.
Thank you.
Sure.
Kei Fujiyoshi is the UTEP residency year instructor and advisor. And Kei and I, many people don't know this, Kei and I taught high school English together at Lakeview High School a long, long time ago. Kei, I was hoping you could talk about the soul strand. And Bill mentioned a little bit ago this the sort of tension within the field, and in some ways the tension within UTEP, right, between practice and theory. Where does soul strand sort of sit on that continuum, or within that tension, and why do you think it's so important to UTEP's model around closing the preparation gap?
Soul Strand is a process. It is a course that we facilitate, but really Soul Strand is the process of individuals to sit back and actually ask themselves, what am I doing here as a teacher? Why do I want to do this work? We think of teaching as a calling. As we're thinking about these gaps, I'm thinking about our approach to preparing our students for Chicago communities. And as we think about gaps, I'm sort of kind of taken aback to think about, well, what are these gaps in our city? And we start with a historical understanding of where we are in Chicago, how we've gotten here, and we think about the city rooted in history as we've sort of seen throughout this presentation of racism. Race is a social construct, and so as we start to think about what that gap looks like in Chicago, we have to understand that systemic racism is something that's creating a lot of gaps. And in my head, I'm thinking of it as a debt. When we think about the impacts in Chicago communities, and as we think about the impacts that are taking place for children. So, as we introduce these concepts to our candidates, we ask them to really think about who they are in the process of this. Where are they coming from? What context are you? Did you live in? And then not only that, if you're coming from all across America, which a lot of our students do, what's your understanding of Chicago? Growing up in Chicago is one thing, but to come from another city and to think about, well, what is it that you hear in the mass media about Chicago, Chirac? What does that sort of do in terms of your own assumptions that you bring to the city as you think about who it is that you want to teach? Who are these children that are sitting in front of you? What do their lives look like? Soul Strand is the time and space for you to actually sit with those questions, and it's uncomfortable. As we know, the teaching profession is 85% white females, and so to think about what that sort of gap in terms of culture, upbringing, just understandings of class, understandings of gender, there's a lot of differences that are there, but at the same time, we also want to think about how it is that we can understand ourselves better so that we can understand how it is to relate to other people. The bigger question that we're asking in Soul Strand is, what does it mean to be human? And I think right now, at this particular moment in history, we're taking a step back to think about what does that really mean for us, and how is it that we interact with one another, and how do we understand our humanity right now? Where is it that we want to go towards? I think this historical moment that we're in presents a lot of like, wow, we have a lot of work to do as a society. So when we get honest about that, and also when we start to think about the inequalities and inequities that are systemically set up, we also have to really consider who we are in that broader context and that broader spectrum. Taking a step back and reflecting and thinking to yourself, like, gee, like, I do come with like a set of assumptions that are kind of, actually pretty messed up. And to be able to look at yourself in the mirror and say that you've got work to do. That's a big step forward, but as we like to say, admission is the first place in recovery, right? At least that's what I hear. It is a process that we work through with folks. It's not easy, but we think that as students go through that process of recognizing who they are, and thinking about who they want to be, and thinking about the debt that we owe to the children of our future, there is a lot of work that people get really serious about, and that commitment transfers into that 5 year, into beyond those 5 years that we're seeing. So the Soul Strand is really that. I think it's hard work because it's messy. It's not quantifiable, but it's a human endeavor. And I think as we walk students through that process with them, they're able to understand their own humanity better, which builds compassion and empathy that then they're able to see and interact and engage children with as well.
So I know that one of the more recent developments at UTEP has been to think really carefully about the trauma that many of the students that UTEP teachers are going to work with face, and that's something that is even more present this year, over the past year, certainly I think, than it's ever been before. Can you talk a little bit about both how Soul Strand might prepare students to be able to do the trauma-informed teaching that you're now thinking about, and what exactly that trauma-informed teaching or practice looks like?
think there's a couple things. There's never a way to prepare a teacher to engage with the loss of a student. Theoretically, you can talk. You hear it in the news all the time, right? That there are children that are dying, that we're losing. But there is no way to prepare you for the loss, especially when you have a relationship with that student. When you know that student, when you know their families, when you know their hopes and their dreams, and you see that shattered. There's no way to prepare. However, in this trauma-centered work, we also are sort of tying that back into human development, and also thinking about what our community, how our communities have been structured, and we think about it in terms of, we don't think about violence as this isolated incident. We're also thinking about structural violence and systemic violence. So what are the conditions in communities that are creating these sort of manifestations of these violent acts? This goes back to sort of the community work that we've also been doing in understanding sort of the systemic analysis of what how communities have been shaped. So historically, and then also thinking about the different layers of employment. So what happens when people lose jobs? What happens then when the homes are lost? What happens when public housing is gone? What happens when public schools are closing? What happens when communities get destabilized? And what happens to the lives of individuals that are living within those conditions? And we think about the reality of the children and the realities that they're forced to navigate. That's very difficult. And we think about the development of children in that process, right? Cognitively, socially, emotionally, physically. What's happening in that trajectory of their life? When we think about things like hope, we have to consider the dreams and aspirations that are also being lost in the process of those conditions. How we're preparing teachers to do this. It's one, being informed about the actual, like, what's actually happening to the brain in terms of when it has experienced trauma. So understanding the neuroscience behind it and actually seeing that the ways in which that brain development has been impacted, it translates directly into the classroom when you see kids being disengaged, when you see kids acting out, when you have kids that are performing in these ways in which you don't understand, and the way that you respond is to be your human self, and sometimes that's not always the highest version that we are. So when we think about understanding trauma, we're also looking at the behaviors and the markers that help us acknowledge those traumas so that we can understand more about this child. It doesn't, and this is where the soul strand part comes in, is because you have to really sit there and unpack your assumptions that you're bringing to that interaction and engagement with that child. And if you're culturally coming from a different standpoint and you're not aware of all of the things that this child is carrying with them and having to navigate and having to experience at a very young age, you can be very damaging in that moment. And we ask our candidates, as they're preparing to do this work, that you should not be that person. So do the work that you need to do up front so that you don't do the damage that you can possibly do in that classroom in a kid's life, because they don't need it. Is there a way to, this is sort of a new endeavor for us this year in terms of unpacking trauma and unpacking that in the classroom. Our first step is to really just understand what that does in terms of cognitive development, also thinking about the social emotional markers, and also thinking about the identity development, the process of that, and simultaneously thinking about how it is that we'll respond. As we do this work, what we're trying to cultivate is the heart, the commitment to our humanity, really, and to think about what it is that we bring to the table. Like, what teachers wear so many hats. Anybody that's worked in a school, you wear a million hats. Savior is not one of them. So when we think about what we're doing, what our commitment is, why we want to teach, we want to first understand who we are. What are our values that we bring to this profession? What does our commitment look like? And what does love look like manifested in those practices? And it's not just this touchy-feely Disney movie, oh my God, I do this kind of all-encompassing whimsical things. Love is commitment, it's a practice, it's ongoing, it's reflective, it's being really, having a conviction to be committed to fulfilling these debts that we have to our kids.
Thank you so much, Kate. Angelica Fuentes is the Manager of Professional Learning for the Success Project at Pasteur Elementary School. Angelica, could you take us back, and we're now talking about the belief gap, can you take us back 2 years ago, I guess it would be, to when the Success Project started? Maybe just say a little bit about what the Success Project is for people who don't know. But when the Success Project started, the ramp up was really quick. What did you and your colleagues learn about yourselves, about students, about elementary schools throughout that process?
So the Success Project is a pilot that started 2.5 years ago now. It's composed of 3 different components, one being 66, which is the curriculum that's been implemented. The high school application process, where we support students on applying to the high schools in Chicago, and then working with administrators and teachers on the 2 indicators that show success for freshmen on track, which is graded attendance. So the way that it started was we were starting in 10 different schools across the south and the west side with 1 dedicated coordinator that was going to be placed at the schools to help push a lot of the project. So we were slated to start early fall 2014, but we got delayed, so we didn't really start until February. So we lost the whole semester of really trying to embed ourselves in the school culture, trying to make relationships and get to know people. There were a lot of things that we learned. I think some of the most important ones were relationships matter. Like relationships will either make things really easy or really hard for you. Everything takes time, and you really need to be in the school setting and working with humans, children and adults alike. You need to be flexible. You need to be patient. You need to be resilient. Given that we didn't start until February, we did have that semester to really plan and try to be as prepared as possible, and we were getting antsy and ready to get started, and we were creating tools and schedules and had all these grand ideas about what it was going to be like once we started schools, and then we started schools and that whole plan went out the window. We started towards the beginning of testing, so testing got in the way, teachers elected to know us, they were being held accountable not held accountable, they were being asked to work on things like 16 and on track and all things that they're not really held accountable for, and so they always had something else that was more taking priority, so a lot of that created a lot of challenges.
So what then are some of the shifts that you made in your work over the past few years in response to some of those challenges? And if you could paint a picture for us of what, maybe with one student, what does closing the belief gap look like?
Yeah, I think overall, across all the schools, the biggest success that we saw was the relationships that we built with students. I think for most, if not all of the schools, even year 1, we were successful at implementing 6-16, whether that was in the classroom setting or pulling kids out, in small groups, or doing the one-on-one with the high school application process. So I think having that space and that curriculum to sort of engage kids in something that they haven't really been engaged in before, so not necessarily anything academic, but really just what is your mission? I don't think kids are asked that often, or they felt like they weren't. Some of them really just didn't know, and I would sit with them for 20 minutes doing these interviews, and they would just be like, I don't know, I've never been asked that. So I think that was one of the biggest successes with students, just developing that relationship. And I can share, there's probably stories across all our coordinators in terms of the successes and the belief gap that we've sort of been closing in on. With the high school application process. So I'll share a story with one of my 6th graders. When I started, I was doing the 6-16 instruction, and the student was very smart, but was also very easily distracted and was kind of bitter for such a young child, just not interested in doing anything. We were working on vision boards, and she was like, why does this matter? I'm a foster kid. I have no choice over anything. I have no control over anything. So fast forward a year, I was no longer teaching 6-16. I had already transferred that to the teachers at the school, so they were doing the 6-16 instruction. But we did surveys to see how the students, what the students were getting and how they felt about 6-16. And
It was anonymous, but I knew what was her response because she made a reference again to being a foster child. And some of her comments were along the lines of, well, I am a foster child and I move around a lot and I don't really know who my parents are going to be or what area I'm going to be in, but at least I've learned skills that are going to help me research the type of schools that I can go to. She's no longer in our school, so I don't really know. This is her 8th grade year, so she would have been applying to schools and doing that selection process. But it was really just heartwarming sharing that story with colleagues and knowing that like the student now has that agency, even if she doesn't have control over where she is placed, she has this sort of internal agency to like, have a say in what she does.
Thank you. The last member of our panel, Gerald Washington, is the University of Chicago Charter's Chief Academic Officer. Gerald, since its inception, Chicago Charter has been focused on the belief gap and on instilling within our students a deep sense of personal agency. More recently, the charter school has developed an agency score that you are following over the course of the year. Can you talk about what that agency score is and how you see it as a critical tool to help close the belief gap?
First of all, good morning. Before I talk about the agency score, I just want to talk about as one of the newest members of University of Chicago Charter team. One of the things you see when you first come in the door, one of the things that you kind of want to, I guess, examine for yourself are some of the stereotypes about charter schools. And one of the things that I quickly noticed when I came aboard was a lot of the stereotypes that you hear about charter schools when it pertains to University of Chicago Charter were not true. For example, this idea that charter schools give up on kids. And I can say categorically that University of Chicago Charter does not give up on kids. Illustrated by the fact that here we are in mid-January and no child has been expelled. So that is, to me as a person coming from the outside, it's like unheard of. You know, you hear all these things about what charter does. With that being said, when you talk about student agency and what it means for our kids, I like to look at it from a couple different angles. First of all, as you look at our kids, we are on the forefront of new research about what's important for student outcomes. Specifically, our work with GPAs with students. We've had very intentional focus with our students on how important GPAs are, not only to their current situation, but also to their future life. It has been at the forefront of all of our interactions with our adult leadership, our teachers, and really to be cutting edge when it comes to making sure that's an important component of our work moving forward as leaders, school leaders. So that's the first thing, that we have made ambitious goals around GPA, 3.5 or above, 33% of our campus, 50% of our students at 3.0 or above, made that a central focus of our work. The second thing, we've also increased our alignment with accountability. Accountability for how we're judged as a school. We've increased our alignment with the SQRP, which is how schools are judged in Chicago. We understand the landscape has become more competitive. So we have to make sure that our students are not only prepared, but excelling in comparison to their neighboring schools. Also, when you talk about belief for our students, it's not just about the data or how good a school is or is not, but we also believe in exposing our children to a rich environment where they can see themselves achieving grand things. People covet what they see, and especially our young people. So we are intentional about exposing our young people to college. We're intentional about exposing our young people to high leverage people who are not just someone we're talking about, but people we can actually sit them in a room with. So, and the last thing is we to address that specific question about agency score. We are trying to figure out ways to not only quantify this work, but to really paint to have children who can speak for themselves, which we do. People who are aligned with their own objectives in life, and are really partnering with the teachers and the administrators in these schools to really own their education and parents as well. So the agency score is a organic thing at this point that we are trying to embed into how we do our work. But a lot of the things that were already occurring in our school system have continued to occur at a high rate. We've just had our best year ever academically from an accountability point of view under the leadership of Shane Evans. We have 3 level 1 schools and 1 level 2+ school. We are efforting to increase all our schools to 1+ schools, and we are trying to maximize our results as best as possible.
And can you talk a little bit also about the belief gap and closing it actually inside of the classroom with teachers? I know that there's been some work to restructure class time to enable teachers to have more space to interact one-on-one with students and have those important conversations. Can you talk a little bit about that work more recently at the charter school?
Sure. So one of our central focus this year, our theme this year has been the Stockdale paradox, where we confront the brutal facts of our reality, and then we have faith that we will prevail in the end. That has been very intentional work with our adults around believing in children not only with words but also with actions, and that kind of aligns with the GPA piece. We've had to work with some teachers on being advocates for students, being rigorous, but at the same time being redemptive in how they interact with students when it comes to grading policies. So we've made that a central part of our professional development with our leadership, our teachers, and also we have really worked with our adults drilling down in the data beyond just percentages, but drilling down to the actual student. So really getting underneath, if 30% of the kids are having problems reading informational text, who are those 30%? Who are those 30%? And what resources are really being put in place for those kids so that they can improve with informational text? To really make a small group instructional more of an emphasis to in our instructional model, so that teachers can differentiate their instruction effectively. So it's a work in progress, to be honest, and we talk about confronting our brutal facts, but we are not going to let it go, and we're going to make sure that our teachers and our leadership are aligned with maximizing outcomes for students. And let me just say this one thing too. I've been doing this a while, and I've seen a lot of the success if you don't. I've seen a lot of failure if you don't get children to align with this belief gap in themselves. And one of the things that's really encouraging about what we're doing that we see most of our kids really believe in themselves not only in their words but in their actions. And we are just trying to align everything, the adults and the students, so that we are as successful as possible.
Thank you. The last gap is the attainment gap, and I'll just talk really briefly here about, I would be remiss without talking about a little bit of my work since I'm up here. The 2 and Through project, which is a project I lead here at UEI, but also with the Network for College Success, who is at the SSA. Our theory of action is that the most important predictor of future attainment, of whether or not students are going to graduate from college, earn a bachelor degree, is prior attainment, and that in order to hit that final milestone, you have to hit the milestones that are leading up to it. So in order to get to college graduation, we need to be thinking about freshmen on track. We need to be thinking about high school graduation, college enrollment, and college persistence all along the way. The consortium has produced an amazing body of work around what it takes to move students and schools through each of those milestones. And part of the work of the To and Through project is to take that body of work and to transform the research into data that schools can use about groups of students, about their schools themselves, in order to make shifts and changes in their actions to move more of their students to and through each of those milestones. You can't, however, as I think has been mentioned up here by Nicole, you can't just give teachers, schools data and say, go use it. And so we partner really closely with the Network for College Success, which is just across the Midway, who brings together all of the non-charter high schools in the city 4 times a year for these massive training sessions that are focused on helping leaders in neighborhood high schools understand the research behind educational attainment here in Chicago, understand how to use the data that they're being provided both from the consortium, the Chicago Impact, the network, but then also the data that they get from CPS. And finally, how to think about translating that data into practices that they can test out inside their school buildings, and how they can learn from others from both similar schools and different schools about how best practices or promising practices are playing out in different contexts. I want to say thank you to all of our panelists. It is so neat to hear about all of these really cool bodies of work that I think are moving the needle for kids across the city and across the country. I would also be remiss without saying that we here today are just sort of touching just a little bit of all of the different work that's happening here at UEI. And so, we talked about 2 consortium studies. There are tons more. If you haven't been on the consortium's website and poked through their work, it is worth your time to do so. UTEP has amazing work that they didn't talk about that gets very specifically into literacy and math, both at the elementary school and at the middle school, and that's focused on preparing teachers to deliver on that very specific cognitive work. Impact has the 5 essentials, which wasn't mentioned yet today, and is a really powerful way of thinking about the school and beginning to change school practices. And just has more recently a new tool, High School Bound, that wasn't mentioned, which is a way to think about, help students select high schools. And then I would say finally, at the charter school, which has 4 amazing campuses, there is incredible work across, in many ways, all of these different dimensions, from math to literacy to non-cognitive efforts. And I guess the last thing I would say is that if you haven't been to one of our campuses, you really should get over there and see the work. It's not perfect. It can always get better, but just being in a school with adults who care deeply and love the children in front of them is so, so powerful. So thank you so much to everyone on the panel and to all of you for listening. I want to open it up to questions from the audience.
Anyone has questions?
Jeannie.
I'd like to go back to the IB study for a minute, and you said that you weren't able to unpack, or you haven't fully unpacked yet, what it was about the IB program that got these tremendous movement from the 5th and 6th day 9 kids, to, do you think that the smallness of the environment of most of the IB programs, in terms of the number of kids and the number of adults, is one factor that might be causative? And do you think that the fact that it's such a focus, a shared focus, like it could be anything, but in fact it's that international baccalaureate focus that helps kind of group everybody and then move them forward?
Sure. I'll say two things. One, directly answering the question, and then the second, sort of connecting it, I think, to some of the things that we've been hearing from other folks too on the panel, because I think it's potentially an intentional synergy that I just wasn't aware of, but the IB study actually fits really nicely here in thinking this way. Yes, we do think that's potentially an explanation. It's very hard to disentangle from the data that we had. We weren't able to really look at those factors and to think in really systematic ways about whether it was the smallness of the programs in the schools we were studying. In most instances, it's a cohort of 30 to 40 kids per grade level moving through together. They start in 9th grade. They move together for all 4 years. They have the same teachers. So you can imagine there are potentially peer effects there, but those are also peer effects for the adults involved. There's a whole range of ways to imagine what that shared focus and goal means for kids in terms of participating in the IB program, being told at some level that you're special from the outset and given attention that's directed at your development and your attainment. All of those potential explanations, I think, though, really rest in a similar set of insights that come out of the work that's going on across this panel here. Right? When you think about what might be going on in IB, it's not unrelated to some of the ideas we've heard here about placing kids in environments that are intentionally crafted to support their development on a whole host of different dimensions. And so when we think we see potential movement on non-cognitive development, I hear real resonance in the way that UTEP is talking about preparing teachers to ensure that whether or not they're in IB environments, whether or not they're in intentionally cohorted groups of teachers in the schools they teach in, that they're getting the kind of support that enables them to provide some of those things that we think might have been at play with IB. So, unfortunately, we can't unpack all of those things. It would be wonderful if we were able to get closer to the causal identification that's always kind of the research holy grail. But your question's terrific because I think it really does point to a lot of the different dimensions of work that are already going on here and how they intersect with what we think we saw there.
Another question? Yeah, Stacy.
So I'm going to go back to the whole presentation, and Dana, I think this question's probably for you, but can you talk a little bit about whether you're planning on sort of pushing these ideas outwards, to whom, in which ways?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is opportune timing because you have folders. Everybody should have a folder.
It was not planted.
I was going to say.
Extra money for Stacy.
So everybody has a copy of the posters that you've seen incorporated into this presentation, as well as a longer form version of them, which is sort of a UEI manifesto. And it really, the idea behind the manifesto is to articulate some of the commonalities and the unifying threads across our multiple streams of work. And, again, as Sarah mentioned when she first started, to help us really get in touch with our common identity. I think, of course, we're going to have our unit identities, and that's great, and we don't want anyone to walk away from those. But I think to the extent that we can connect some internal dots and just listen to and learn from each other and make connections like the connections that Dave was just making and some of the panelists up here have made, I think that's going to help all of us really deliver on the promise of UEI, which is research and practice coming together under one roof. And so that really is the purpose and spirit behind all of this. In terms of pushing it out more broadly, Sung and I have been, where's Sung? We've been hard at work, Sung, at identifying wall space within Chapin Hall that we can legally use. Some of these posters, and actually have placed the order. We met with Sharma and Lynn yesterday, who outlined exactly where we can place things. And so you'll see some of these posters up on the walls internally. And we are working on a website reskinning or refresh, so that on our homepage when you land there, you still see the topic-based, the taxonomy that we have on the website now, but you get a sense for what UEI as a whole is, and so we're working on that. And that right now is sort of our plan for pushing it out, and then we just want it to kind of continue organically. We'd love to have these sessions quarterly and really delve deep into individual gaps and topics surrounding them. Today was just sort of a tasting planner or a sort of sampler, if you will, to get everybody informed about the broad range of work that we're doing.
And I'd actually like to add on to that, which is to say, I think that closing the gaps in many ways has two meanings, right? So we've talked today about the gaps that we're trying to close for students and adults, primarily in Chicago, but also across the country. But I also think that one of the reasons closing the gaps is powerful is because it has internal meaning as well. It is a call for us to close the gaps internally within UEI. And as someone who is not located within a unit, I see the amazing work that happens across each of the units. And I want to also name that I see some skepticism within each of our units about the other units, about the work that happens outside of your day-to-day. And there are some tensions between our work. There's no questions about that. Those tensions exist. But we can't be scared of those tensions. We have to confront the tensions that may exist between our different lines of work. And we, as a leadership team, will try as hard as we can to be intentional about creating the structures to bring people together internally, to begin to close some of these gaps. And I would say that to challenge each of you, if you heard something neat today about another unit, if there's something that you've always been curious about, a consortium study, one of the campuses, the Soul Strand, or 5 Essentials work, to send an email to someone today or this week and try to get on the calendar for coffee. Try to get on the calendar for a lunch. I think we can be as intentional as we want at the sort of higher levels, and we are committed to that. But it really is also about making this come alive in terms of the relationships that we need to begin to build across units. So that would be my challenge to all of us, is to try to be more intentional about building relationships across units with people who are doing different work that is maybe related and may challenge and push your own work and the way that you think about education.
So on that note, we have 15 minutes left. I think there's more food back there, but we would love to just let you guys mix and mingle. There's also a postcard in your folder. Everybody should have a postcard, I think on the left side. Go ahead, Ashley, and this is just, while it's fresh, we're hoping that everyone can take a minute to fill this out, just with one thing you've learned today, one new idea, one thing you might have taken away about a unit's work that you didn't know before and you want to learn more about. And drop those postcards off. Ashley has a box because we're going to be doing it, as cheesy as it sounds, later, a drawing. And we originally promised door prizes, but they'll be coming after the fact. So we drop your postcards off and we're going to draw out 3 at random, and those folks will win some cool stuff. So mix, mingle, fill out your postcards. And then
There are mugs outside.
oh yeah, there's mugs. Everybody gets a mug. That's a little swag.
They're at the table.
I love mugs.
Thank you. Would you like to keep forgetting.